Thank you, Alan. Hi, everyone. My name is Sim, and
I'm Joe.
Yeah, we're from Cecil Housing Cooperative in Brighton, and it is lovely to be invited to talk to all of you today. Yeah, Alan, are you able to share our slides?
I am. Thanks for reminding me. Forgot I had that other important function.
Amazing. All right, cool. Yeah. Yeah, so in case you didn't know what we are talking about today, we are talking about our journey with setting up and, as of recently, living in a student housing cooperative. I helped with setting up Cecil. I have now graduated. And Joe here,
I am lucky enough to be living in the results of all of this hard work. We've begun the process of working through the space, and things are pretty great.
Yeah.
Things are pretty great.
Yeah, and you're currently a student, aren't you?
Yeah.
Which is great. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, just any housekeeping. So you're aware that the meeting's being recorded. Keep the video on, that's totally cool. Probably questions that you've got into the chat. If not, if you want to wait, we've got we should have 20 minutes if we go to plan for question and answers. But yeah, I'll be keeping an eye on the chat as we go along. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is going to be what we talk about today. We're going to spend a little bit of time introducing cooperatives, housing cooperatives, and then we'll talk a bit about student housing cooperatives and how they are a bit different from some other housing co-ops, and some examples. And then we'll just sort of try and set the context a little bit, talk about the housing crisis, what it's like to live in the rented sector, and particularly what that feels like as students. And then we will go into why we set up Cecil, what our motivations are, and why we were keen to pick the cooperative model to set up. And then we've got a bit of a timeline, and we'll talk you through. I mean, we go back as far as 2016, but we didn't incorporate until 2018. So mostly the last 3 years of our journey, and the last 6 weeks in which the Cecilters have moved into their house. Yeah, and then we've got Q&A. So that is our event plan, what we hope to cover today. Yeah, let's get started.
So this is just a personal definition, but I always like to think about cooperatives as it says, organizations in which all of the different members participate on equal terms about how the organization is run as it progresses and the things it goes through. Not everybody can necessarily decide these things. It all depends on who's a member, but they're all different kinds of co-ops, and who becomes a member of the co-op is going to depend on what kind of cooperative it is, really. Yeah. And we've got the cooperative principles: voluntary and open membership, democratic membership control, members' economic participation, so you're part of it in more ways than just voice, autonomy and independence. It gives you the ability to make decisions and then kind of work through them. Education, training and information, cooperation and cooperatives, and concern for community. I think that last one is my favorite, really. I mean, they're all important, but I think at the end of the day, it's all about fostering community and working with the people around you, really. Yeah. I hope it didn't go on too long. So what's a student housing cooperative? Well, if a cooperative is an organization where everybody works on an equal participation kind of foundation, a housing cooperative really is just a situation in which you're living together and you feel a little bit more power to take control of the situation in which you're living. Yeah, anyway. So Sea Salt was founded in 2018, as it says, based in Brighton, up in, I believe it's Bevendine. We're in the process of settling into the new house and, as I say, working through the space and figuring stuff out. And it's the beginning of a process. But we're not alone. There are already flourishing student housing cooperatives in Edinburgh, Nottingham and Sheffield, as well as Birmingham.
Slide.
Yeah, so this one I think is mostly inspired by what housing cooperatives, specifically student housing cooperatives, well, housing cooperatives in general are sort of existing in response to. The UK is experiencing, as I'm sure you're all aware, a really severe housing crisis. But I like to think of this personally as an ownership crisis, because in the UK, 2019, they said it, it was found that lack of affordable housing had resulted at the time in 1.1 million people on the housing waiting list. 8.4 million of those were living in really bad, unsustainable, unsuitable, unhealthy conditions. And that was just 2019. I don't know how it's going to be changing it'll have changed in 2 years, but yeah, it seems to be getting worse. On top of that, only 5% of the UK land, like the whole UK land mass, belongs to homeowners. So it's a really tricky situation. So in 2011, actually, this is something I found most striking. In England, twice the amount of land used for all housing is taken up just by golf courses. So I think, if housing cooperatives are responding to one issue in the context of the UK, it's the fact that we need to deal with the fact that land underneath us doesn't belong to us, and we need to start being able to take control of where we live and the spaces that we move through, and yeah, basically taking control of our own kind of accommodations. Yeah, this is a bit of a wordy slide, but I feel like it's an important slide because it's an important kind of topic. So why a student cooperative, housing cooperative specifically? Well, students are often prime targets for exploitation in the form of high rents and poor quality housing and tenancy contracts. Students, a lot of them haven't read, or they're not used to reading contracts. So there's a lot of stuff that they might not be as used to. So students on average in the UK pay an average of £126 a week. And I mean, if you think about the whole of the UK, all of the differing ranges of rents, that's a wild statistic. The amount of money that goes in per week. And 56% of the students in the UK live in private rented accommodation. Tying these things together is the fact that it's recently been, the conclusion that's recently been come to by a lot of organizations is, in the face of the climate crisis, even before we talk about the treatment of students, we also need to consider that the houses that this country has, they are not fit for the climate the changing climate environment that we're living in. So these houses aren't even built properly, regardless, you know, they're not even built in a sustainable way, and the rent is really high. So it's kind of compounds the issue. I think my other concern personally is where you do see a lot of student accommodation popping up, it's usually owned by a number of I don't know if they are transnational, but very large corporations.
Yeah.
And they aren't accountable, and they don't build things sustainably. Companies in the UK, I don't know how far out they go, but companies like Unite Students, well, I mean, I don't know how many times I've been talking to people and they've said something along the lines of, yeah, well, this city is just a student city. Like, you can only tell that story so many times, really. And the students aren't happy with the accommodation most of the time either. Not the ones I've talked to. The rent is way too high. The buildings are only made for one purpose. And quite remarkably, actually, possibly due to the corporate kind of nature of this housing, if you look into the law around it, they don't actually classify as housing. And as such, they aren't subject to quality control that you'll get with other housing. So people can cut corners. I mean, we know what happened, you know, with Grenfell cutting corners. We know what have happened with a lot of situations throughout history where housing has found, you know, its way into cheapness. It really is atrocious. Yeah.
Next slide, please. So I think a lot of the problems that Joe raised are not specific to Brighton, but in Brighton some of them are kind of compounded even more. So we are a seaside town, and we do have so it's quite a small town. You know, we've got the Downs on the north and the sea at the bottom. So there is a limited amount of land that can be built on, and that does just mean that there is a lot of competition for housing in this city. Now, there are a lot of students in Brighton, but the whole population is about 300,000. And because Brighton is quite as expensive as it is, and it's based in the southeast, it does just mean that it's incredibly difficult to find affordable housing, particularly as a student. I remember most students looking for rooms in shared houses, because that is the most affordable kind of places, and the kind of halls of accommodation type that Joe was talking about, they do tend to be a lot more pricey. So rented housing is a way to sort of get out of that. Houses of multiple occupancy, student houses, tend to be sort of range from 100 to 150 pounds a week, whereas if you were to live in halls, they could be close to 200, 250. And there are loads more being built at the moment if you come to Brighton, but they are incredibly expensive, and they're not owned by us. So next slide, please.
Oh, if I might add as well, I don't know what might have changed in the last year or two, but a couple of years ago, did quite a bit of research, and turns out that at the time, Brighton was actually the second most expensive city to rent in the country, outside of London. But the difference is, London, you get a special allowance. You get a little bit more money because it's London, from student finance. You are accommodated somewhat for that. So Brighton is phenomenally expensive. Yeah,
absolutely,
particularly.
Yeah, next slide, please.
I think that's it.
Say again.
I
What?
think that is the next slide.
What motivated us to get started? Please?
Oh, sorry. Yes, what motivated us to get started? And I guess the next slide has some pictures. Thank you. Sorry, we didn't do a run through of this. Yeah, okay, so here are some pictures starting from the top right, one where lots of us wearing yellow. And that was in 2016. So actually, in fact, I should start with the top one on the top left. So there are a couple of student cooperative organisations, not necessarily housing, but other student co-ops in Brighton. And that's me in the centre wearing the blue jacket. And when I started university, I joined a bicycle co-op because I didn't want to buy a bicycle and I wasn't very confident riding on the roads. And it was called Recycle, and it gave us an opportunity. It allowed people to rent out bicycles quite cheaply, and yeah, meet other people who were doing similar things. So I joined that, kind of not realizing at first that by renting a bicycle, I became a member of the co-op, and as such had a voice similar to everyone else in the co-op, which was wild to me. I had never experienced this sort of thing. But that would have been my first or second year. And I quickly got into the hang of it. And you can see me there holding some sort of inventory. I would have been helping these people rent out their bicycles. And through those other student co-ops on campus, I found out about Students in Cooperation, which is a democratically run federation of student cooperatives representing and supporting emerging student co-ops across the UK. Essentially, it's like a national body that lots of student co-ops are a member of. And through that, I went to a conference and met loads of other student cooperators across the country, including Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op, which is the biggest student housing co-op in the country, with over 100 members. And I could not picture this. I had no idea what this would be like. But this was the first time that I heard about it and found out that it was actually quite possible. It was incredible to see that it was possible. And I think a big part of what motivated us to get started, but for me at least, my personal journey, has been seeing other examples of it happening. Yeah, this was in UEA. I just want to kind of make the point that as like people in our early mid-20s, we've only ever lived through neoliberalism, right? We haven't seen anything outside of this like late stage capitalist mode of living. And I could not have imagined a different way of doing things, a different way of like, you know, rich people being landlords and letting out, and that serious power dynamic between landlords and renters. And these two pictures for me kind of symbolize that. They symbolize imagining other alternatives. So that would have been in my second year of undergrad. I then went away and did a year abroad. And when I came back, the bottom right picture is like an info event. And so I was at University of Sussex Student Union. We had a sabbatical officer who liked the idea of setting up a student housing co-op. And in fact, there was one iteration back in 2011 or 12, but that was when there were massive occupations happening on campus. And so when I've spoken to people from them, they've said, we really wanted to try and set up a student housing co-op, but none of us had the energy to because they were occupying buildings. But a couple of years later, someone who is in the top left photo, on the right of me, that's Lindsay, she had it on her manifesto and really wanted to do this again. So we sort of had these like different people talking about it, wanting to try and do something. And we had an info event, I remember, in February 2018. Just talking about why would you want to set this up? Do you think you'd be interested in this? And I remember this quite clearly because I was definitely procrastinating from writing my undergraduate dissertation, which was due like 2 weeks later. I was like, I want to do other stuff. And so I joined this, and pretty much since then, since February 2018, Seesaw have had weekly or fortnightly meetings and coming together as a group. And yeah, that's sort of where it all started. Next slide, please. Yeah. So now we're going to talk a little bit about when we sat together at the very start, the first 6 months or so. What were we trying to envision? What did we want Seesaw to look like? And obviously why we chose a co-op. Next slide, please. Okay.
Yeah. So Seesaw specifically has 6 community values, or cooperative values. And yeah, they kind of sort of embody what we kind of want to move toward, basically, and provide. Yeah, the first one, quality, providing high quality housing. Very simple, that one, but it's really important. Yeah, because you've got to live. You've got to live in a quality environment. You've got to make it an affordable quality environment, because we don't have the money to shell out. So providing affordable rent, creating a community, a vibrant community of knowledge and skill sharing. Yeah, just living together, engaging in the things that you would, and living in the house cooperatively. Democracy, education, cooperation. I think democracy is the, well, perhaps the simplest of all of them, really, because it's just the basic process that you go through when you sort of work together to decide things about the house and decide how you want to organize the space. It's the process you go through just living in the space. Mm-hmm. Education, educating members, the wider student body and community about cooperatives. We want to be an active part of the community, and we want to be able to learn. We want it to be an ongoing process of learning and engaging, basically. And cooperation, we want to work with other cooperatives. We want to work with other communities, and we want to form connections.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I think all of them are sort of easy to list, their values, but they are difficult to live. Providing quality housing, it requires a lot of work and maintenance and ongoing stuff. And democracy is maybe the easiest. Sorry. Democracy is maybe the easiest to understand, but it is a muscle. We practice it every day, working together, communicating, trying to participate on equal terms, and that is hard, but it's rewarding. I don't really want to romanticize this. Co-op living can be incredibly difficult sometimes, but it's worth it. And I think when I think about like living in a shared house, I think I might, run into problems. If I was living in a rented house, I might run into problems and not actually address them. And co-op living sort of forces you to address it or supports you into addressing them, which I found like something that is much needed, I think. Okay, next slide. Just going to run through some examples of these. We had some community engagement a couple of years ago, and we got some stories, and these are only 2 examples. we met a resident who was really worried about her neighbours. The damp in her property was so bad that 3 years in a row, the students living there had been hospitalised with serious lung conditions. Different tenants every year. Every year she would try and help them fight the landlord, who refused to do anything until the ceiling caved in. Yeah, I don't know if you've been students in the UK, but this is not an unusual story. The next one says, we had more rats in our building than people in lectures. It is really unfortunate that so many people over so many generations have like crap student housing stories. But this is the kind of context that we come from and the thing that we want to improve. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so just to say that we've changed over time. So a really key difference to think about between housing co-ops and student housing co-ops is that we, students graduate every year. And so we'll generally get we'll have new volunteers like every September, October time, and a lot of people will leave kind of end of the year, May, June. And there are people who stay for multiple years, but there is a shift in who we are. So I think in the top left corner, that was when we were trying to come up with the name CSALT. CSALT, by the way, is an acronym. It stands for Southeast Students Autonomously Living Together. And so we came up with that, sat on the grass. The picture at the bottom is, I guess it's too far away to see the photos, but they are a lot of different people. And that was when we had just got some grant funding, I want to say from Homes England. That was in 2019. And then the top one, we've all got masks on, was the first time that we actually met in person in August 2020. And so we'll talk a little bit through the timeline later on, but I think over COVID, a lot of our volunteers left and understandably had different things to prioritize. And so over that summer, we kind of recruited a whole new group of people, Joe included. And we, just entirely met online until this time when we met in person. And we couldn't get the pictures for the most updated group of students, which you said was on Dan's camera.
It'll be with people soon,
yeah.
hopefully.
But it is like slightly different group of people. I think in the top right, that's sort of closest that you get. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, and we've had lots of help. It's just trying to think about the communities that we've been part of. The top left is sort of, we had one of our meetings in the Bevy, which is a cooperative pub, and we really liked doing that. Top right corner is, top right picture, sorry, is I think a Co-ops UK events, which was held in Brighton, and so we kind of networked with a bunch of other co-ops in the city. Bottom right corner, that's all of us having dinner at Birmingham Student Housing Co-op when we went to visit. And you've got bottom left, that's Lloyd Russell Moyle. He is our local MP who's been really supportive of us actually in the past. And Caroline Lucas in right hand side, who's also said some really lovely things about us. And yeah, it's just, it feels like we couldn't have done it without all of the support we've had along the way. And of course, last but not least, Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust, who have been super fundamental to us. So they kind of came to our original meeting back in February 2018. And I don't think I've explained this properly. The house that we now live in, they own. So we've worked with, CSAL has worked with Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust over the last 3 years to kind of raise this money. And so they have a mortgage on this property here that we're in right now. And CSAL have got a 7-year long lease with them. And obviously with the opportunity to renew every 7 years. Which I guess means that we have a much longer lease and a lot more autonomy than a lot of student houses. Yeah, we've had so much help. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, yeah, and just taking us through our journey so far. I'm just checking the time. It is 7:25. Am I right in thinking we've got 20 minutes left? Is that, yeah, okay. Try and whiz through this bit then. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so back in February 2016, that's where it all started. That's where I actually met Lisa, who was our project enabler. And we met in Norwich and had no idea that we would go on to kind of work together to set this up. But that was where things started. February 2018, that next picture is a flyer of the info event that we had. August 2018, again, I don't know how well you can see this, but we're all smiling very widely. And we've got a certificate because we just incorporated then. September 2018, that looks like a meeting that we had straight after Freshers. So we had a bunch of interesting people sign up and come along. And in this kind of time, we were focusing a lot on trying to build our values, our mission statement. We came up with our a few policies, so the membership policy and the rent and arrears policy. Yeah, and so much work went into that. In August 2019, Bed and Breakfast, we put in planning permission for Bed and Breakfast to try and purchase and convert it. I don't know what people's experiences of the planning department are. They took a full year to get back to us. By the time they did get back to us, the B&B had been sold, but it had meant that we had made some really good links with the planning department, and they very slowly got their head around what a housing co-op could look like, and like what kind of planning class we would fall under and such. Yeah, and before that, there was another house at care home, which we looked at buying. That unfortunately got sold to luxury housing developers because we need more of those in Brighton. And this like massive, beautiful house that could have been like 18 bedrooms became like 6 luxury houses or flats. It was disappointing, but obviously like shows us so much why we needed this. Yeah, so you know, we kept looking at houses and trying to get finance. February, March 2020 was when we launched our community share offer with Ethics. And so we had a share offer open. It was only meant to be open for a couple of months, 3 months, maybe 3 or 6 months. But obviously that was just as the pandemic hit. Next slide, please. Yeah, that's when COVID hit. So we ended up extending our share offer until the end of 2020. And so it did take us longer, but we did end up raising £360,000. And so that was actually money that we were able to put towards a deposit, put towards raising, doing renovations on the house. It really made the whole project viable. And I've already shown you that picture from June, July 2020 of when the new volunteers, of which about half of them are currently living in the house. Yeah, in November 2020, we got match funding, which was incredible, from People's Postcode Lottery. And we met our target and exceeded it, in fact, September 2020. And you can see that we kind of made this slide before we moved in, because it has a generic house picture rather than this house address, which is obviously much newer. Yeah, and basically we, Brighton and Hove Community Land Trust put in an offer on the house. Next slide, please. I think this is all on there. Yeah, they put in an offer sort of April, May time, and they signed the contract in July this year. And in September, I think you have to say this part because I haven't actually moved in.
Yeah, no, in September we moved in. Yeah, we've been here for a little bit over a month, and the process has begun. It's very exciting. Still reeling a little bit. But yeah, it's been a wild old journey. I have been here for an incredibly tiny fraction of the journey, and it's still been an incredible journey. I can't imagine what it's been like being here from the start.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the volunteers who put a lot of time and energy into setting it up kind of knew that they were never going to get to live there, because they would have gone on to graduate and move away and do other work. And I graduated end of 2019, and I've sort of vaguely been part of Sea Salt, less so this year. But yeah, I think that is just testament to what it's like setting up a housing co-op. Yeah, future tenants will always benefit so much, and they won't necessarily have been the people who helped set it up. Okay, next slide, please. I think that should be it. That's maybe our last slide. Yeah, I can put those links in the chat. But yeah, we've got some time now for Q&A. I think we've got, oh my God, we've only got 5 minutes. Ooh. Sorry, Alan.
No, I think it's good. We've got 15 minutes.
Oh, okay, I miscalculated.
Until I think that's right. Shall I stop sharing and then?
Yes, please. Yes. Cool. I'm just going to pop our website link in the chat. Yeah, and we've just got time if anyone has any thoughts or questions.
Yeah, while people are thinking about that, I wanted to ask what democracy looks like in the house now, in terms of, you know, what decisions you're making and what's that process like?
Well, democracy is a process which can take a little bit of a time every so often, and because we haven't fully settled in just yet, we're still trying to organize time in such a way as to get most people together at, you know, at the same time, so we can decide things together. But yeah, we've started making plans about the garden. We've started making plans about what we want to put there, the kind of things that we want to sort of do in the next 6 months. But then short-term projects as well. Might seem simple. I mean, to me, it's incredibly unsimple. It's absolutely spectacular. I've never painted a wall in my life, and it's the most thrilling thing to do. And deciding, do we want a chalkboard wall? How big do we want the chalkboard wall? Small, but very big. So we've been kind of deciding how we want to organize the living space, and deciding how to deal with settling in, really. Yeah, it's been a mix of different things, really, but it's been really good.
Yeah, I think that's a hard question that you asked about. What does democracy look like? I don't know that I have an answer. It looks like so many different things. Do I have anything interesting to say? I'm going to come back to you on that one.
Cool. Thank you. Does anybody have a question they'd like to ask? Jo has got her hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Would you do anything differently if you were going to do it all over again? What would that be? If anything, might not.
Is that from like moving in, or like setting up from the start? I guess, who do you want to answer the question?
Both of you, because you might have very different perspectives on it. And I guess from the start of the journey, really, from deciding you wanted to take control of your housing situation.
Gosh, that is a really good question.
Hmm.
You want to go first, shall I?
You go first.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
I reckon.
I mean, I probably just can't stress enough the importance of like getting to know the other people. and whether or not that's like whether you're still organising together as an unhoused project, or that you're actually living together. I guess it was quite difficult when, like, you know, a year and a half ago, COVID hit, and that just meant that things were so much more difficult. And obviously I couldn't change that, but maybe a really simple thing that I would do is just have people spend more time together. Really practice this, what democracy looks like. Really practice honest communication with each other. Like, there's a lot of technical things, or like financy things that you know, are difficult. And you know, I'm a young person. I've never lived in a house that I owned before. Like, well, you know, I don't know how to paint a wall, for example, that sort of stuff. But the stuff that I find really hard, and I should say I've lived in another housing co-op for the last 2 years since I graduated, and the thing that I find really hard, that I want to practice, that I know is just always a practice, is communicating, democracy, honesty, and really being caring towards each other. And that can look like different things. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah. Like you.
Yeah, I mean, regarding what I might change, it really is a difficult question. I mean, I think I might have put more time into preparing myself for the reality that I wouldn't be living with the people who I'd organised with as much. I'm living with some of the people I've organised with, but I don't think I processed that very much beforehand. And yeah, I think it would have been good to do that. But yeah, like, in any case, there's you know, work to be done, getting to know everybody, and that's a really difficult question. Yeah, I suppose as well, for me, it's kind of currently in the midst of it as well, anyway, because it's going on right now, and it's an ongoing process, really. So yeah, it's hard to look at it from a sort of outside perspective, but I've really enjoyed it, the whole journey. Just looking forward to sort of seeing what comes next. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great.
Thanks for that question.
Is there another question? Yes, John's got a question. Thanks, John.
Yeah, so hi both, and thanks for a really interesting presentation. It's great to see sea salt up and running, and you know, we've had a little bit of an insight into your project over the last year or so with Brighton CLT. So it's fabulous to see things really happening. I just wondered, you know, given the time and the effort and the barriers and so on, do you still feel that sea salt, after all that, is a catalyst for other student housing cooperatives to form and get involved? And, you know, I suppose on the back of that, what do you see are the biggest barriers that stop it happening elsewhere to replicate the success of what you've done?
Yeah, in terms of how we might envision the ability to replicate sea salt, I think it's difficult. It might be difficult to answer that, again, because we're in the early stages of moving in. And I think maybe the best way of doing that is through kind of methods like storytelling. And there are fewer stories to tell because it's the early stages, but it's, yeah, I think for everybody, it's already kind of a tangible experience with living in a cooperative environment. And yeah, like it's very, very different from the environments that we usually inhabit. So that's immediately going to be a really kind of powerful catalyst for a lot of people, because they can then say they have lived in the alternative, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that. Like when we started, there were no other student housing co-ops in the South. And like the co-op movement is relatively small, but you know, when we think of student housing activism, like my mind immediately goes to rent strikes, and you know, those are popping up all over the country. And there is that link between rent strikes as like fighting against this system, and housing co-ops as building another one. And yeah, we've definitely like you know, talked to each other quite a lot about what these things might look like. So I think my answer is mostly that yes, in knowing that it can exist, that can be a catalyst, and that was definitely the case for me. In terms of your second question, biggest barriers to replicating your model. I mean, I think our journey would have looked quite different if Brighton and Hove Community Land Trusts weren't set up at the time of this. And I know that there are community land trusts across the country. There are fewer hubs, community housing hubs, which like give, you know, advice and support and, you know, training. So local support, I would say, might be a big barrier. Brighton has quite a history of cooperatives. No, everyone has that.
No, I think that's, you know, I mean, we know the housing co-op scene in Brighton quite well, because as you say, there's quite a few, and the hub, the CLT and the hub are sort of working across the city and beyond to sort of expand that and share resources, which I think makes a massive difference. And you know, from the outside looking in, I mean, it seems to me that it is a replicable model. It's just that student housing co-ops on their own need a sort of sponsor or partner to go into that kind of model with, and be able to, you know, with a small c, commercialize it. And I think that's the beauty of the way it's worked with yourselves in Brighton.
Yeah, I'd definitely say like financing it was always like the big question. How the heck are we going to do this? And it's no small feat, but yeah.
But the community share issue is an encouraging result, isn't it? To show that there is investor appetite out there for this kind of thing.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I guess we'll get on to more of that in Andy's talk. But before we move on, is there any other pressing, burning questions that you can't hold?
If I can hog it slightly, I was just going to ask about the proposed retrofit of the property, because I know that's something that was very much a part of your thinking, and you explained in the presentation about wanting to live in a property that's sustainable for both current and future residents, rather than the sort of conditions that some of the private student accommodation, rented accommodation provides. So I just wondered if you could give us a flavour of what sort of things you're thinking of doing.
Yeah, we are planning to do a series of different retrofitting things, involving insulation, involving, I don't know that it's a closed plan, as much as we need to continually assess to see how best we can adapt to the different ways in which we could make the house more sustainable and environmentally friendly and energy saving. But I think tied into the sustainability question is also accessibility. And our first priority is, well, I say our first priority simply because of Brexit and because building work is, it's not in short supply, but there are interruptions. So we're currently undergoing plans to knock 2 rooms through and adapt them and make the house accessible to one of the members who doesn't get on very well with stairs. I mean, there are a lot of stairs in this property. There are a lot of stairs in this house. So yeah, the plans as far as retrofitting go are ongoing, but I think it's going to be easier to answer that question when we have a slightly better idea about the larger structure after accessibility has been addressed. Yeah. I hope that answers your
Okay, thank you. Yep.
Gareth, I noticed you've taken your mic off. Do you have a question? He's put his mic back off. So yeah, I just had one, like, because I wanted to invite you guys along to this meeting in Wales, partly because, you know, we've seen this all this amazing activity happening elsewhere, and I'd like to be able to bring this to Wales and encourage a student housing co-op somewhere in Wales. There's plenty of different universities, and we're obviously, it's a much more widely spread target, if you like, in terms of reaching out to people. But I just wondered if you had kind of one step that we should be taking now, bearing in mind your experience, to go forward with this.
In Wales?
Yes.
Do we have any Welsh students on the call? Can I check first? Oh, damn it. I guess that's step one, talk to the Welsh students.
Yes, we have been doing that, but you're absolutely right.
No, I understand. The most difficult thing is, honestly, like, a really, really difficult thing that I encountered was freshers' fairs, and someone's just arrived. A really difficult thing that I encountered was having freshers' fairs and having like 30 seconds to explain to a student what a student housing co-op is. And that is such a difficult thing. It's like, can I get housing now? But why? And it never made any sense in that short amount of time. So maybe I would say, like, find ways to creatively explain what student housing co-ops are, so that you can then go on and talk to people about it. But it's really helped to find connections. So I'd say we definitely had a lot of success speaking to students' unions, not the universities themselves or their housing departments, although it may be different, but speaking to, like, lefty students in lots of different spaces tend to be the ones who are interested in this. Find good ways of explaining co-ops, and then talk to them. Do you have anything else?
I can't think of much to add to that, apart from just, the people who are going to be most motivated to galvanize action are going to be the people who are directly experiencing the difficulties. So yeah, I think it probably just comes under, making an alternative feel possible to people, and having good stories, having ways of explaining things. Pretty much.
I hope that's not too vague of an answer for you.
Well, that's a great answer. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, well, let's go for a break. And I mean, you've got an amazing story already. You were saying that the story is still quite new, but you've already got like quite a massive story, and I'm so inspired by all the work you've done to make this happen. It's a really incredible thing. I know how much work goes into making a housing co-op, so well done, guys. And yeah, I wish you every success with Sea Salt and whoever you inspire next. And thank you for being part of this evening. I hope you'll stay for Andy's presentation and carry on for the Q&As afterwards.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
We really hope to see more of these in Wales.
Yes, great. Okay, we'll have a 10-minute break, and then Andy will take you on to the next part of the session, which will be looking specifically at finance and financing your housing co-op. So brilliant. Stretch your legs, and then we'll be back soon. Okay, thank you. are now.
Great. So hi everyone, my name's Andy. I'm a co-op development worker with a specialist in finance and housing. So that's probably why I've been asked here today. I have lived in housing co-ops. I helped set up my first housing co-op in 1998 in Nottingham. We didn't have, that was when we started. We actually bought our property in 2001. It's called Ned's in Nottingham. And that was not financed by the Ecology, it was financed by Triodos, but it was part of this network called Radical Roots, which I wasn't at whole of Sim's presentation, I'm sorry, but hopefully Sim mentioned. It's an amazing co-op of co-ops, and through Radical Roots and through my housing co-op, I learned a lot about financing housing co-ops. I've helped an awful lot of housing co-ops over the years through Radical Roots set up. I was part of their finance group. And then I helped set up another co-op in, I think 2012 we moved into, or 2013 we moved in, called Wild Peak in Derbyshire, which is financed by the Ecology Building Society. And I lived there for a few years. So I've got quite a lot of experience of co-ops and housing co-ops. Today, I'm going to try and talk to you about the different business models that are out there for co-ops, because there are a number. And when quite early on, one of the things that you need to do is work out what business model you're going to go for. So it's quite technical. It's a relatively dry. There won't be lots of nice graphics like there was in Sims and Joe's. But as Alan said, co-ops are businesses. Yeah, they might be registered as societies rather than companies, but they're still a legal trading entity that has to make a surplus, has to be able to pay back the finances, can enter into contracts. And as such, you have to manage it like you would manage any other business. So the first port of call for managing any business is to understand what your business model is. So today, because we've only got an hour, I'm just going to talk about what the different types of business models there are. And I'm going to focus on the most common, because it's the simplest and the most common. I'm also going to say, if you're not going to choose that model, if you're going to choose one of the other models, then I suggest very strongly that you get professional advice very early on, because they become really messy, or they can become really messy, and you have a whole number of different taxes to worry about. So that's not just myself jumping at work. So first of all, I'm going to share my screen with you, and then I'm going to ask Alan, who I can see, to nod his head if he can see my screen.
Yes, that's good.
Great. So those are the three co-ops I'm currently part of at the bottom. We're all co-op development organizations that help co-ops in different ways. So what I'm going to talk about is the capital and the revenue finance model of 5 different types of co-ops. So the capital is the big money that you need at the start and at various points throughout the life cycle of the co-op to buy big stuff. And the revenue is the ongoing expenses, the ongoing income, the ongoing expenses, and how you deal with that. So the 5 that I'm going to talk about are effectively the ones that I'm aware of, and there might well be many others. But I'm going to talk about the buy-to-let or even lease-to-let approach. I'm going to talk about the various shared ownership or rent-to-buy schemes. I'm going to talk about quite a radical new type of housing co-op called mutual home ownership schemes. I'm then going to talk about what CSIL did, which is partnershiping your housing co-op with a community land trust. And I'm also going to talk about the possibility of what are called secondary co-ops, which are co-ops of co-ops, and how that can be used to help set up your business, your finance. Okay, so I'm going to start with the buy-to-let or the lease to let is the most common. So we're going to spend a lot more time on that than we are on any of the others. So it's what we generally think of as the traditional housing co-op. I might need help, sorry. Cydweithredu.
It's Cydweithredu.
Cydweithredu, my apologies, in Mac is a very new and recent example of this kind of housing co-op. It's by far and away the most common type that's been set up in the UK over the last 40 years. And effectively what happens is the co-op purchases or leases one or several properties, that doesn't matter, and then it rents those properties to its members. So it's very similar to the whole buy-to-let mortgage scenario, although obviously the people that live there are the landlords. You don't have this external landlord relationship, yeah? And the living situation for one of these types of co-ops can be very varied. Yeah, we're talking here about business models, not architectural styles or how you live together. So the properties that you buy or a co-op could buy could either be a shared property, like which is called a house of multiple occupancy. Sort of shared sort of student style, although to be fair, I lived in one till I was in my late 30s, so probably not necessarily student style. Or they can be self-contained units, a flat where you live on your own, you live with your family, you have your own kitchen, you have your own bathroom, or it can be a mix of this approach. So it's a relatively simple business model. You buy a house or you lease a house and then you rent it to your members. In order to do this, you will have to cover certain costs. And so at the start, you'll have a whole load of capital costs. And these are all the different things that you need to think about when you're getting together your business plan, your financial forecast. And if you are doing a buy-to-let approach, then I would talk to Radical Roots. They have a fantastic spreadsheet which basically does this for you. The things that you need to think about is you need to have enough money to buy the property, or if you're buying land and developing it, which is a perfectly reasonable approach, the land and the development. That's probably something you've all thought of, but there's other costs that you possibly haven't thought of. So you'll need to have land transaction tax. I know there is some work being done in Wales, but just so you're aware, at the moment, the land transaction tax for an incorporated body buying residential property, which is generally what this would be, unless you're buying more than 6 units at once, but let's just leave it. Is generally what this would be. You'd be paying the higher rate. So there's 4% on every band, which makes it a bit more expensive to think about. Because there's a disconnect between the rental market and the property market, you also are going to often have to think about, well, we might have to convert a space, we might have to do an extension so that we have more lettable spaces. Or if you are buying land, there's the whole development. You will need a solicitor. Probably for the entire lot, generally I'd advise, but you can do the conveyancing yourself, but you will need at least a solicitor to hold the mortgage whilst the transfer happens. And you may need an architect, you may need planning. So you need to think about all the professional fees that might be related to that. Or this is too much for you, and so you need to employ someone like me, in which case, maybe the Welsh Co-op Centre will be paying me, but maybe you'll be employing me directly. So you think about those things. The more novel your model, the higher these professional fees are. The more off the shelf your model, the cheaper it is, because people have done it before. So we don't need to create new legal documents, etc., etc. Any form of loan that you have to cover this will have a cost associated with it. So you need to think about that, include that in there. And it's quite a small fee, but you'll need to incorporate. So you'll need to become a legal entity that does this. Very strongly suggest that you incorporate as a society, because otherwise you're going to have some corporation tax issues. You can either go to the Welsh Co-op Centre or you can go to Catalyst. And there are different rules with slightly different situations, but yeah. That's incorporation. So that all costs money. Where do you get it from? Well, you have to go, generally you have to get a mortgage. The ethical lenders include EBS, who are obviously here. I strongly recommend you go to them first, mostly because they offer a 40-year mortgage, and the thanks, John, and the increase in your cash flow. The effect that it has on your cash flow is enough to make it worthwhile going there first. But you can also consider Triodos, Nationwide, and Unity Trust are all places that I've come across that offer mortgages. The thing to remember when you're doing a modelling, if you're modelling this in any way, shape or form, is that these tend to have variable interest rates. So they track the base of England, the Bank of England base rate. And we obviously can't make a prediction about what's going to happen with that because it's doing crazy stuff, but it's at an all-time low, so it's likely to go up. So when you do this, you have to predict, you have to plan for what would happen when the interest rates increase. Yeah. And quite importantly, there's a cash flow. They have a big effect on your cash flow because you have to pay them back. You have to pay them back every month, yeah, without fail. And some of the other financing we talk about is not a monthly repayment, but these are have a very direct effect on your cash flow. If you're doing building work, or especially if you're doing a new development, you can't really get a mortgage to start with. So you tend to have to get a development loan or a bridging loan. Again, I'd go to the same places. That's usually slightly more expensive. But what happens is you don't pay anything during the period of the development when you've got no money coming in, but they then get converted into a mortgage at the point that the development is finished and you are getting money coming in. Yeah. So those are all relatively straightforward and you probably are aware of them. This is the more sort of interesting thing. So you can go to the public and ask for finance. In general, it is illegal for most organizations to go to the public and ask for finance. It's an offense under the Financial Services and Markets Act. But there are specific exemptions, and one of those exemptions is co-ops looking for loan stock from the public. So you can go out and you can ask people to lend you money. So loan stock is a debt. Yeah, it's a debt. You pay it back. But it's like a bond. You get given it for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and you pay it back in full at the end with a fixed interest rate. Housing co-ops can't do community shares as a rule. There are complicated mechanisms where we can make it work, but as a rule, housing co-ops can't do community shares because the point of shares is that it incurs membership, and housing co-ops only have as members the people that live there. Yeah. So if you did a share offer, you would have to have members that didn't live there, and then you would no longer get your corporation tax exemption, and that's quite important. So if you are thinking about shares, then that's got to be invested by its current members. So the people who are planning on living there have got to have enough capital to be able to do this. We're not going to talk much about that, because if you've got enough capital to be able to do this, I'm less interested in helping you. The other source of finance specifically in Wales is the social housing fund, but you have to be a registered social landlord to be able to get that. It's grant finance. I can't remember. I think it's 30% of the, up to 30% of the property. I'm not totally up on that. Maybe Alan could.
I think it's 56%.
Is it 56? Okay.
There's variable Hugh is putting in the chat as well. They've just changed the rules just recently.
Okay.
Currently, it used to be, I think, a 58% intervention rate, but they've changed it now, so it will vary based on local authority and need. So it could be that some areas only get 20% and others might get 80%.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. But really importantly, you have to be a registered social landlord if you wish to go down that route.
And I would say that that's very much easier for housing co-ops in England than it is for Wales, and it's unlikely to happen for a housing co-op in Wales at the moment because the government is not encouraging that. But you could work with a housing association or a council.
So that's the big amounts of money that you've got to spend, and those are the places you can get that money. And then you have ongoing costs. So you have to be able to meet your monthly mortgage repayments. You have other costs. You have to have buildings insurance. It'll be a condition of your mortgage that you have buildings insurance. If you are leasing a HMO, a house of multiple occupancy, to your members, then you have to pay. The landlord is responsible for the council tax. So the council tax is another ongoing cost. You've got the whole load of admin. If you want to put it out to management contract because you can't do it yourself, management contracts, bookkeeping, potentially end of year accounts, and then quite importantly, repairs and maintenance. You know, these are houses, they have to be repaired all the time. Those are sort of the monthly or yearly costs, but you also need to be able to build up enough of a cash surplus to be able to do these on these bigger costs. So if you have taken out loan stock, which you will need because you won't get more than 70% or 80% from the bank, you need to be able to pay it back when it falls due. So you need to be able to build up enough of a surplus to be able to do that. Or, and you know, one of the models that often is done is that, okay, you can't pay it all back, so you refinance at that point in time, but you need to have built up enough of a surplus to reduce the amount that you owe so that the next refinancing is for less and less and less. Property improvements and plan renewals. So every 10 years, you've got a plan to do major works on your property. We generally recommend about 15% of the value of the property, 10 to 15% of the value of the property every 10 years. You know, that's for things like the kitchen needs replacing, the roof falls in. If you've already owned a house, you will be aware that this happens, but you may not be aware of how much it happens once you have more than one family living in a property. Yeah, things wear out quicker. Okay, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of ongoing costs. Where are you going to get it from? Well, there's only one source really. There's one major source, which is it's the rental income that your members pay to live there. Yeah, your members basically pay you rent, and you use that to cover all those costs. It is possible that you will have some other form of space that you can let out to community groups or worker co-ops, and that does happen quite a lot in housing co-ops. what's important to bear in mind is that the corporation tax exemption that is available for housing co-ops is only available to rental income from members. So any other form of income that you will have to pay corporation tax on any surplus, yeah, relating to that. So that's a lowering of any surplus you might think might happen at that point in time. It also, lots of housing co-ops can get exemptions from HMRC for filing corporation tax returns, because especially smaller ones, because you can say it's like, we're never going to have to pay any tax, so it's kind of unfair, which means that they don't have to pay it for an accountant. At the point that they're having to fill out a corporation tax return, it's really complicated. You can't use the free software from HMRC, so you will have to pay an accountant. So unless this is a substantial income, there are definitely some cons to it. Yeah, you will have to pay corporation tax on it, and then there's the additional cost of accounting and bookkeeping that goes with that. I am rattling through it. There's a lot. My details will be shared by Alan for questions if we can't. Yeah. I realise that I'll probably flood everyone's brains, and they'll go, what did you say about that, Andy? And I'll explain. So just email me, yeah? So I'm talking about this because you'll see it. I actually strongly don't recommend it anyway, but I even more strongly don't recommend it in Wales. So, but I'm mentioning it because I don't want you to go, oh, there's this thing that's happening in Leeds, and therefore why aren't we doing it? So the major reason for this, for the what's called CHACO, or Chapeltown Co-housing Projects in Leeds, to use this is because the Homes England grant for shared ownership doesn't require you to be a registered social landlord. Unfortunately, in Wales, the shared ownership grant does require you to be a registered social landlord. So your advantage has gone, and so you'll only have the disadvantages. Yeah, so I'm not going to spend very long on it. Effectively, what happens is the housing co-op builds or purchases homes and then sells part of the property to its members. So the members have to find the money to buy that part of the property. The members then pay rent on any remaining part that they don't own, yeah, the bit that's owned by the co-op. There are complicated rules which are different in Wales, which is why I didn't go into massive detail, but they're different in Wales to England, about effectively the staircasing. So at various points in the future, the residents can buy more parts of the property, and therefore increasing the percentage that they own, which then reduces their rent. This is a separate grant scheme, and I think this one is, or at least in the guidance, which was probably from 2019, so it might not be relevant, but this was about 30% grant scheme. The major problems, and there are two major problems which you should always be aware of if you're going to go down this route, is that one, the property is legally always tied to market value. Yeah, so one of the great things about housing co-ops is we can disconnect property, which is something we should all have a right to live in, from the market, which is basically about speculating and extracting value as much as possible for capitalists. And co-ops break that. Unfortunately, because of the rules related to, well, if you get a grant to do the shared ownership thing, the rules relating to that is that the property is tied to market value, so you can't break that link. And one of the other problems is that you've got to allow your members to always be able to end up owning it entirely, 100%. And that means that as a housing co-op, you have lost control over that property. So I don't recommend it, but I thought I should point it out because you might have come across it and I didn't want you to suddenly go, I should do that. if you're going to do it, please get support at a really early stage. So Gautier, who's also on this call, and I spent, I think it was 20 days modeling this for a co-op, and then advising them not to do it in York. And we are, this is what we do on a day-to-day basis. We build spreadsheets to model finances for housing co-ops, and it took us a very long time to build this one. It's really messy, so I don't advise just doing it on your own. Yeah. This one, however, is more interesting. So this is what's called mutual home ownership schemes. One of the problems with the buy-to-let type of housing co-op, or one of the perceived problems, I'm not necessarily sure it is a problem, is that you, as a member, you put in a lot of money over time as rent. You put in a lot of time because depending on the style that you do, whether you've got management contracts in or not, but like the co-ops that I lived in didn't have management contracts. So we had to manage everything ourselves. We did all the building work ourselves. The one in the Peak District was like 2 years of nothing but building work. And then when you leave, you have nothing. And this is great if there are shed loads of housing co-ops and you can just go, well, this housing co-op isn't working for me anymore because my life's, what I need from life has changed. I've now got a child, so therefore I need more space. I'm now reaching retirement age, now I need less space. All these different needs your needs might change. And unless there's another co-op for you to move into, the way the rest of the housing market works, capital is quite useful. And so you don't get a chance in most housing co-ops to build up capital. Yeah. So the point of the mutual home ownership scheme was it was designed to enable that to happen. So during your lifetime of living within the co-op, you can build up capital which can be removed when you leave. What I haven't talked about, and what I'm not going to talk about at all today, is co-ops where everyone requires capital to move in. I'm not interested. Go and pay someone, because you've got capital, you can pay someone. Go pay someone, sort it out. Yeah. What I'm actually interested in is people who don't have capital being able to find secure housing. So this is a way for that to happen, but potentially at the end of it have some capital to be able to move on if they wish to. The way that works is that the co-op buys, although in generally develops new housing, and the members can live in that, and they get a lease to live in that, and that lease is done in exchange for purchasing equity shares in the co-op. As far as I'm aware, there is only one in existence, which is Lilac in Leeds. But there are several in the pipeline, or quite far down the pipeline. So Lowfield Green in York is going to be one, Terrace 21 in Liverpool, and probably the closest to you, actually maybe Liverpool could still be, Harbour Terraces in Stroud. How they structure themselves, all of these four have different models. Yeah, and what I mean by that is, what share do you have to buy? What level of deposit do you need to have that happen? How much cross subsidy happens between the richer and the poorer members? So for instance, Lilac in Leeds, everybody pays a third of their income in rent, well, in monthly contributions every month. But they're all trying to build up roughly the same amount of equity shares, and they build it up over time, and some people end up paying more than their equity shares. Some people will take a long time to build up their thing, but they've decided that they wish to make it more equitable. Lowfield Green in York, the way it's working is literally you will buy the equity share that's equivalent to the value of your house, and you will be lent that money by the co-op, and then you pay it back over time. And there's no cross subsidy at all. Yeah, so they all vary. So the advantage of this is actually it's really flexible. You can design your own system. One of the things that's happened to us a few times, Gautier and I are both on the call, is people have come to us and said, we'd like to set up a mutual home ownership scheme. Can you write us a spreadsheet? And we have to say, well, what do you mean? How do you want this to work? So actually you can be in the driving seat, so long as the co-op has enough cash to be able to pay back its mortgage. All of those things, you can make this as flexible as you like. The capital costs of this are pretty much the same as the buy-to-let. Yeah, you've got to purchase your property, you've got to purchase your land, you've got to develop your land. There will be land transaction tax. Your professional fees will probably be quite a lot higher, because once you start doing development, there's all the extra professional fees: architect, site manager, project manager, construction engineer, etc., etc. But also the solicitor's fees are also going to be significantly higher, because there's complicated leases to sort out and make watertight, and there aren't so many standard ones you can just take and walk off with. So imagine those things are going to be higher in this model. The sources of the capital are pretty much the same, but you have no possibility of a social housing grant using this in Wales. And one of the things that is quite common, or at least all of the schemes that currently plan to have this as a requirement, is that because the members are going to be building up capital, they require a deposit of different sizes. But that is then for another source of capital, yeah? And, you know, when people are talking about 10% deposits, that's a substantial amount of capital, yeah? From every single person, you know, when you add it together. The ongoing payments get split into two. So you have your revenue costs: management, insurance, small repairs, bookkeeping, those kind of things. And the members pay rent. Part of the monthly contribution from the members is rent, and that covers that. There are ongoing capital costs, such as paying back the loan finance, building up the reserves to be able to do all the stuff that the buy-to-let stuff has to do, but also purchase back your leaving members' equity shares. And these are paid for by members buying equity shares. And that's how the business model works, is that there is the rent that covers the expenses, and then people purchase shares. Roughly, people purchase shares on an ongoing basis that covers the capital costs. If you're going to do it, please get some help quite early on. It's much more complicated, yeah? Much more complicated. So we talked about this earlier. Well, I didn't talk about this earlier, but Sim talked about this earlier, the partnership with the Community Land Trust. So any of the three things we just talked about could also work in partnership with the Community Land Trust. So this isn't a different type of housing co-op. Any of the other types of housing co-ops could work with the Community Land Trust. And there are some advantages for doing so. The major one that most people like is there's access to a different type of finance, which is this share capital invested by the public, called community shares. Because the Community Land Trust can raise the share capital, and then people become members of the Community Land Trust. The other advantages, especially if the one that I'm most familiar with this, which is your space in Leeds, which I've done a lot of work on, is that they're planning on being serial developers. So the Community Land Trust is going to do several developments and work with housing co-ops to control each of those developments, so that you build up the support and expertise of a wider group, and communities can decide we think we need this kind of development here, which is really good. But the people who live there get to control their own housing, which is also equally good. So this is balancing out that we have to manage. The way this tends to work, and this isn't, Sea Salts is slightly different because Sea Salt is leasing from the Community Land Trust on a sort of more annual basis rather than selling a leasehold. But the way this is working with your space in Leeds is that the Community Land Trust raises the finance, ideally through community shares, because it's a very good source of finance. It's patient, as in it's long term. You don't have to pay it back on a regular basis. You also don't have to pay it back if you can't. You also don't have to pay the interest if you can't afford it. I mean, you have to be honest with people about this, but those are quite good forms in terms of, those are quite good advantages in terms of finance. And the finance that the Community Land Trust raises, it uses to do early stage feasibility studies. Is this going to work? Especially if they're developments, we need to know before we start putting, before we start spending lots of money on planning, et cetera, we need to have very early stage feasibility. Is this a goer? Then we need to purchase land, get planning, and maybe do some of the early stage development, put some services in, whatever it's got the money to cover. Then it sells a leasehold, a long lease to a housing co-op. The sale of that leasehold covers the costs that it's just done and enables it to be able to repay the community shares. But, and this is the important bit, at this point in time, the housing co-op's got no money, so it can't pay for this leasehold. So in order to enable it to do that, the Community Land Trust lends the co-op the value of that leasehold. And then the housing co-op pays the loan off over time. And the Community Land Trust uses the cash income from the cash in from that loan to pay back the community shares. Yeah. The co-op has the same business model as any of the other ones we've just talked about. Whether it's a buy-to-let, it's got the same business model as a buy-to-let, the shared ownership or the MHOS. The only difference is that now it has another loan that it must pay back, which is the loan for the leasehold from the Community Land Trust. If it's now doing a development, it gets a mortgage, but it gets a development loan, does a mortgage, all of that. Your space is a really good example of how this is intended to work. It hasn't happened yet, but lots of people are very interested in this model, and they're the ones that are furthest along the line. You do not have to just copy their model because they want to work with mutual home ownership schemes, but you could work with it buy-to-let, like Sea Salt. It doesn't have to be a mutual home ownership scheme, but go and look at them. Again, without wishing to be disparaging to any of you, I don't think most people could do this without serious help. So if this is what you want to do, get help early. Yeah. The last one is secondary co-ops. And in this model, co-ops band together to share their resources and, importantly, their capital. And what they do is they form a secondary co-op, which is a co-op of co-ops. What the secondary co-op does is it owns everything. It owns all the property, and it leases on a rolling, rolling yearly or 5-yearly or 3-year lease, whatever, but a short-term lease. It short-term leases each house out to the individual co-ops who then manage them. So they get to manage their own property, but they don't have to own the property, and the property is owned by the secondary co-op. And this is a really useful model in two scenarios, really. One is basically if you have a group of older co-ops. Now, older co-ops are often asset rich. There's a number of reasons for that, but one, they bought property when it was cheaper. Two, they've paid off their mortgages. So they've just got money coming in. They don't necessarily have as many expenses. They do have all the repairs, etc. But they're asset rich, and they some of them wish to help create newer co-ops, because for newer co-ops, the financing is always difficult. And one of the ways that they do that is by transferring the ownership of their co-op, of their property, over to a secondary co-op. And this protects the asset-rich co-ops. Actually, it protects them from the actions of individuals who wish to carpetbag, who wish to privatize collective ownership. And that does happen with older housing co-ops. We come across this quite a lot. And this creates, because the ownership is now with a co-op of co-ops, private individuals would have to control all of those co-ops to be able to privatize the assets. It makes it a lot harder. The other situation is where they're invaluable is there's a group of co-ops who would struggle to get finance. And this is where they're definitely happening at the moment. Gautier's on the call, was very much involved with student cooperative homes, which is a secondary co-op of student housing co-ops. And this was an idea that we came up with to, lots of the mortgage providers wouldn't lend to student housing co-ops because the ethical lenders want to have a continuity of relationship with the people in the co-op. Now, students are obviously transient. They're only often at university for 3 years, maybe 5 years, maybe doing a PhD, transient community. And so they found it quite difficult to get mortgages. So the whole point was that there was this secondary body that was more stable, that was professionalized, that could get the mortgage, also do a community share offer, and purchase the property and then lease it to all the individual co-ops. One of the other advantages, if you're thinking big, and I like to think big, and I hope we all like to think big, and think about what's going to happen in 40 years' time. I don't want the co-op that I'm part of to go down the road that some of the older co-ops have gone down, one of which they get privatized, the other of which is that basically, because they don't have to pay a mortgage anymore, they slowly reduce their rent to virtually nothing. And they sit on these big assets. And then there's huge amounts of people who are going, we need capital. We're desperate for capital. How on earth are we going to set up a housing co-op? It's unaffordable. And it's used to make sure that those surpluses are kept going to regenerate new co-ops over time. The 3 examples I can think of, there are probably loads more, but these are the ones I know well: student cooperative homes, the Cooperative Living Freehold Society, and the Alliance of Cornerstone and Equinox. Cornerstone and Equinox are 2 radical roots housing co-ops who have decided they've been going for a long time now. They've paid off their mortgages. They are relatively cash rich, and what they're doing is slowly going around buying out the mortgages of other co-ops to enable them to then buy more mortgages out from other co-ops to get to the stage where we're generating enough surplus to build new co-ops. So putting that in at the start is really good. I think I've just talked really fast for a really long time. And any questions?
That was super interesting, Andy. Got so much to think about with that presentation. Thank you. And Casey's already put a question in the chat. Do you want to come in, Casey, and ask that question?
Yeah, thanks for that, Andy. That was super interesting. Yeah, just a quick question on mutual home ownership societies. And you might have covered this, and sorry if I missed it. But when a resident leaves, there's obviously, they will get some equity to take with them. So does the incoming resident have to fill that void, or will that be covered by the surpluses of the co-op?
So, I mean, at the moment, it's up to the individual MHOS scheme because they're all quite flexible, because they're all quite new. But all the ones that I've worked on, the co-op pays the equity out, and the incoming member will have to pay a deposit, the same as everybody else would have had to pay, but they don't have to cover that that thing, because the whole point is that we always have ways that people who don't have lots of capital can get into a secure housing situation. And I think with your space, and because they were working, I don't know what stage they're at now, but they were working with EBS. EBS were talking about potentially having the ability to remortgage at those stages to be able to.
Yeah,
I don't know where they are, John. You will know more than me.
Well, I don't know about that. I thought that was really interesting stuff. I mean, just on that question of equity being recycled within the MHOS, and whether the society can effectively buy out the equity that the leaving member wants to take out. It is quite a complicated scenario, because if that happens regularly and often, it's not really sustainable from the society's point of view, the borrowing society's point of view, because it tips their borrowing requirements either into unaffordable levels of mortgage repayments, or from the mortgage lender's point of view, it could take the overall lending outside of the sort of loan to value maximum that they're prepared to do. So those are both issues, but one of the challenges that we have with this is, as Andy says, we can lend over up to 40 years, and that was, partly down to the support of Andy and Gautier and others in the movement to sort of get that term of loan agreed with our regulators, who weren't all that keen on it. But the point is that if you've got a 40-year loan already, and then the only way that the borrowing entity can take on additional debt is to further extend that loan, that's when it can be a little bit problematic. So what we tend to do is say to existing clients and new borrowers coming in asking that kind of question, is that we can't give you a cast iron guarantee that we can uplift additional borrowing requirements like that, and that we'd have to look at it on a sort of live scenario basis, really, because it depends on the circumstances across a number of variables. That's not to say that we're not keen to do it and help, but I guess from the society's point of view, the Mutual Home Ownership Society's point of view, the perfect scenario is probably somebody coming in with equity that replaces the equity that's been in there in the first place, which keeps everybody's sort of debt cover issues down to the level that they were at before the transaction happened. But as Andy rightly says, every society that I've come across so far, and there's not that many, but there's quite a few coming through with this kind of idea. They all have their own views on how they're going to do it, and it's why there aren't 100 mortgage lenders trying to find their way around this, because it's not straightforward.
The one that does exist, the one that is actually has been around for a while now, which is Lilac in Leeds. One of the things that they do with this, everyone pays 30% of their income as rent, is the excess in those people that have got an excess above the equity shares that they're buying, goes into the pot to pay back the equity shares of other members. So that's their neat trick of doing it. So there's always a neat trick that you have to find. I'm not saying there is always a neat trick, but for it to work, there's always got to be a neat trick that you have to find.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hands going up all over the place. We've got Joe and then Hugh.
Thanks. I don't know if my question actually is for Andy or whether it's for John, or maybe both of you, because you might have opposing views on it. Why don't more high street lenders lend to community-led housing?
I mean, okay, so I can answer. My experience is there's just not enough of it. So it's too niche, it's too complicated, and they've never heard of it. So why would they, how does capitalism work? Well, effectively, if you're going to sell a product, you want to sell the same product to a large number of people with very little variations so that you can, in effect, maximize your profits.
Mhm.
And if you come along and say, I want to do something completely different, they say, sorry. Yeah. Whereas there are a small number of really lovely ethical lenders. I mean, you know, and I'm saying, if you notice, the Co-op Bank wasn't on my list.
Mhm.
Yeah. And I, you know, it gobsmacks me, but I've had meetings with people from the Co-op Bank and said, you were set up, this was before they were privatized. This is when they were still the Co-op Bank. It's like, why don't you lend money to housing co-ops? What are housing co-ops? It's like, yeah. So that's probably why. John might have their own answer.
Yeah, I'd agree with most of what you just, well, all of what you just said, Andy. Really, I think it's partly to do with lenders generally having a volume-driven approach. You know, if it doesn't fit through the call center and fill out the form sort of model, it's less likely to fly. I do think they're missing a trick, and an increasingly important trick in not being involved. You know, we spend quite a bit of time talking to the wider community-led housing network and sector, and the pipeline of projects that we've experienced over certainly the last 3 or 4 years. Cheryl will no doubt agree with me, has ratcheted up quite significantly. And that's not just housing co-ops, but CLTs, co-housing, mutual home ownership, etc. And so, you know, we see this as a big part of what we do, but we're quite small. And so it's well worth our while, but it's worth our while for a number of other reasons, which I'll maybe talk about a little bit later. But I think it does require organizations to have the knowledge and the specialism to understand and speak the language, as it were, but also to be able to deal with what I would loosely describe as restrictive covenant lending, which is where property can't just be sold on the open market afterwards, and that's something else that's an issue around CLTs and to an extent co-housing as well, and that puts off a number of the sort of mainstream residential mortgage lenders from lending to buyers on schemes like that, whether it's shared ownership or whether it's keeping properties at a percentage of open market value rather than full market value. Again, they don't have the systems and the specialisms and little parts of their organization that deal with that in place. And I think Andy's right, they perceive it to be niche, and so niche that it's not worth spending the time investing in, which is really sad. But I think that's the crux of it, in honesty.
Can I just add one last thing, Joe? If you're going to do it, so I listed in my slide the ones that I know regularly, or at least semi-regularly. The top 2 regularly lend housing co-ops, EBS and Triodos, Nationwide and Unity sometimes, and it's a bit more complicated, yeah. But loads and loads and loads of other co-ops have got mortgages from other people, but they have to be small local institutions. So old building societies will do it if you can build up that relationship, because they're small enough to be able to, you know, they don't go through call centers, and they do have that relationship building. So, you know, I don't know where you live, I don't know what your local bank building societies are, but if there are people, it is worth, you know, going to them as well as obviously EBS or Triodos. Yeah.
It's great. Thank you.
Hugh, do you want to come in? Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, hello folks. Thank you for a fascinating session. I got quite excited listening to the idea of was a cooperative of cooperatives coming together and lending money or get other co-ops off the ground. And I've immediately emailed Alan some wacky idea to chase up tomorrow. On the subject of wacky ideas, and tomorrow we've got a session where we'll be hearing about the state of the CLH scene in the Netherlands, which is much more well established, I think, than it is certainly in Wales. And it got me thinking about the potential for international cooperatives of cooperative, that we have got these, networks of really well established co-ops abroad. It's a much bigger deal in Europe. And I wondered whether you guys were aware of anything of that nature, or whether you think it's just a terrible idea and not something to raise with the bloke from the Netherlands tomorrow. I don't know what you think.
There are international federations of co-ops, quite definitely. There are international meetups. There have been international meetups of European federations. So Radical Roots is a co-op of co-ops, and it's met with the Miethausen Syndicate in Germany, and there was a big one in the Netherlands, but it stopped. But what we've never tried to do is share assets across borders, because it's fucking messy. Yeah, sorry, but it is. It's just like that, it's messy enough within the UK. Like, I had to change, well, I mean, this is a new presentation, but I had to go LTT. It's got a whole different set of rules to LBTT, which has got a whole different set of rules to SDLT. Yeah. ATED only ever applied in England and Wales, but not Scotland. It's that level of stuff can be really messy. But once you start talking about sharing assets across borders, you need a whole raft of lawyers that are much better qualified than myself to do a whole load of fancy work.
It's late.
It's a nice idea. It's just, oh God, yeah.
Thanks, Hugh. I'll look forward to reading that email in the morning. Did anybody else have a question related to Andy's presentation? Anything that they weren't quite clear about, or would like some kind of further explanation on? Obviously, he says, and I'm really happy to do this, to forward questions to him via email. You all have my email now, but if there's anything now that you'd like to ask, this is a really good chance to do it. Casey's got her hand up again. Great.
Sorry, I've got another question. And it might be a really simple answer, actually. So in terms of the secondary co-op model, would that work with other sort of legal structures, so community benefit societies, that kind of thing? No, because I've got a group, well, a community benefit society that want to sort of band together with a load of other sort of asset-rich organisations, community organisations, social enterprises mostly. They want to pool their assets together, set up a separate body, and then use that sort of collateral to raise a mortgage or raise development funds to provide affordable housing. And I don't know whether it's just a pie in the sky idea or whether it's actually feasible.
Oh, okay, I shouldn't have just shook my head. That is complicated, but it could. I'm trying to work out. So, a community benefit society could be a member of a co-op. That wouldn't be a problem at all. It's just when you said community benefit societies, I was wondering whether you meant you could have a community benefit society of community benefit societies, and that becomes a bit messier. The problem, once you involve anything that isn't a housing co-op in that thing, is that the corporation tax exemption goes. Yeah, the corporation tax exemption is only valid for housing co-ops where all of the members are tenants and all of the tenants are members. Sorry, all of the members are tenants or prospective tenants, and all of the tenants are members. And that can go up. We've recently got a legal advice and found out that can go up as many levels as you want, so long as everybody in it is a member. Yeah?
I'm thinking off the top of my head here, and it does sound quite a complicated proposal, or quite interesting. I'm just wondering, I don't know what you think, Andy, whether some sort of guarantee scheme could be put in place, like, you know, for the umbrella body to become guarantors, for example.
I mean, it's totally legal. The question is whether someone would lend to it, and that.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, that might be worth exploring, and be interested to take a look and see whether it's something that we could make fit. But as Andy says, we need probably to tap into some legal expertise to see what the implications would be. But it does sound an interesting thought.
So I'm an hour later here, Casey, so I'm quite tired. So if you want to email me that in the morning, rather than trying to get me to think about really complicated things at 10 o'clock at night, it might work better.
Yeah, no problem. It's a very early idea, so it does need some fleshing out, but thank you both very much for that.
Just to say, Casey, I'm no more efficient and better at 9 in the morning than I am now. You know, this is as good as it gets, I'm afraid.
Same for me, John.
There's a couple of comments in the chat from Gautier and Jackie, I think it is, just Jackie. I don't know if either of you want to come in on what you've written there and explore a bit more around that.
Hi. Sorry, I haven't put my camera on because I've got quite bad internet tonight for some reason. So I'm trying to save a bit of bandwidth. Yes, I've just put a couple of comments just around the international cooperation and some initiatives which have tried to create some international cooperation project for community-led housing. So just some resources, actually, especially because I spelled it wrong. So it's not Mobi, but Moba, the one in Eastern Europe. Yeah, and so, but as Andy said, it is quite complicated, and they've had to get a lot of legal expertise on, especially because, yeah, you know, the legislation is so different between different countries. There is also the issue of currency. So yeah, it just gets very complicated. But when you get to a certain scale, and that has been the case in Switzerland with very, very large housing co-ops, which have got so much money and so much assets that they can actually take the hit of things like currency change and things like that. So they have actually created quite large loan funds to subsidize a project internationally. And again, the other organization I quoted in the comment called Urbamonde is an organization that has been involved with helping setting those sort of mutual aid mechanisms up. So maybe if people are interested in that, you can contact them. And yeah, I mean, just saying as well that there is potentially quite a lot of implication or quite a lot of potential for the secondary co-op model in terms of kind of unlocking some resources in the sector and you know, kind of allow us to scale up quite well and get a lot more actors involved if those get to scale at some point. But there's still, you know, there isn't really a lot of secondary housing co-ops set up. They're mostly prototype of ideas currently. So we are kind of working to set them up and to kind of get a model up and running and replicable currently. So hopefully there might be some kind of report or something coming out on this model fairly soon.
Brilliant, that'd be really useful, Gautier. And I should say that Gautier is running 2 workshops for us in November on financing your co-op, looking at the different things you need to understand about accounting processes and principles, and also introducing the software Newcash, which is available for free. I think that's right, isn't it? You know, from the open source software for accounting. So in a moment, I'll put the link to those workshops in November in the chat. I just wanted to ask at this point, introduce John. Well, he's already introduced himself, but whether you wanted to talk a little bit, and Cheryl as well, about the Ecology Building Society's community-led mortgages, and kind of like, I wanted to ask the question, which will be, I think will be helpful to groups, is what will you be looking for from them in terms of their sort of first engagement with you? What do you want to see from them in terms of like feeling that you could go forward with a project?
Yeah, okay. No, thanks. And you know, hello again, everybody. I'm guessing there's quite a few familiar names and faces, but for those of you who don't know much about us, we're Ecology Building Society. We're also a mutual, so we're owned by our members. And they become members by putting savings with the society. We were formed in 1981, really as an antidote to what was a very conservative, with a small c, mortgage market that wasn't really geared up to help with self-build and co-ops and use of materials that were not brick and block. And guess what? There's still lenders out there that are still not comfortable with any of that in some parts of the market. So, so we were formed, you know, to address those kind of issues, and sort of very much a cottage industry rooted in activism, really. And we're now masquerading as a, you know, respectable financial services organisation, but we've still got this sort of beating ethos underneath all of that, which is to support mutuality and to particularly encourage sustainability. And that's, you know, very much, I think, in synergy with the community-led housing movement for all sorts of reasons. That they're tackling issues around affordability, as we heard from Sea Salt, and Andy touched on some of the challenges as well in his presentation. But also, you know, shared resources, living in spaces that are making best use of sometimes limited resources, but also encouraging our borrowers, whether they're housing co-ops or individuals, to look at the carbon impact of their living arrangements, tackling things like energy efficient improvements, and if they're building new, then we look to encourage minimum standards of building to ensure that we're not adding to the problem of a property sector that needs a lot of work to make the journey to lower carbon emissions a reality. So we see the housing co-op movement as very much a part of the solution rather than a problem. And I think, you know, 99% of the groups that come and talk to Cheryl and I about their project, we don't need to really educate them on the need for thinking about those issues. They're already looking to tackle those issues as part and parcel of having more affordable, comfortable accommodation, as well as often having an affinity with what our members are about, which is, you know, making society a greener place to be. So to pick up on your question, Alan, I think you know what we tend to do at Ecology is, before you get into the formalities of making an application and committing as a group to application fees and having evaluation done and all of those sorts of things, is that we take a look at as a first pass of looking at the makeup of the group, the constitution that you're trying to establish, look at the initial financial modelling that you've done, whether that's using the radical roots model, which I heartily recommend, as Andy says, for housing co-ops, or something else if it's something else. But to take a look at basic things like affordability. Have you stress tested for what happens if interest rates rise? Have you thought about longer term costs like maintenance and repairs, and what happens if people leave, and all of those questions that Andy was covering very eloquently earlier. And that enables us to come to a view on the makeup of the group and the financial requirements of the group, and to be able to issue, if we think we've got something about right, we can then issue a formal illustration to the group to say, this is what we think we can potentially offer you in terms of interest rates, fees, the term of the loan, and all of that stuff, before you commit to doing anything about paying a fee and making an application. So that's not a guarantee that at that stage a loan will be forthcoming, but it's you know that you're kind of pushing against an open door a bit more. And then we move on to assessing the case with our lending committee once we've had a valuation done and taking a look at the detail of the financial model. And that might include things that come out of the valuation around works that are needed to be done to address structural issues or damp and timber issues, or simply, you know, better insulation, replacing a few windows, putting a different heating system in, and all sorts of things like that. So I guess the message I want to get across is it's quite a sort of bespoke process. We look at each case on its merits, but we're used to looking at projects in this space, and it's something that we've sort of developed and honed over the years, but knowing, as Andy rightly says, that there will always be something comes along that's a bit different, and we're not going to look at you like you've got three heads if that's the case. It's just, you know, can we make it work? Is it viable? We've got good relationships with the community-led housing hubs around the country, which Seasalt referenced in their presentation, but also with people like Radical Roots, Gautier, Andy, Alan at the Co-op Development Agency, and others who can assist in getting the package right. And so I would like to stress that we don't expect groups to come to us with a fully fledged, absolutely polished business plan and presentation with financials that, you know, are gleamingly accurate with absolutely everything answered. That's not our expectation. It's great when it happens, but it doesn't happen very often in truth. And these models are subject to change. You know, things happen, people leave, a bit of extra loan stock comes in or doesn't come in, and stuff like that. So, you know, it's about developing a relationship as much as anything else. And then, you know, once we've got comfortable with the sort of general direction of travel, it's about being able to obviously deliver what you need as a group, which is a commitment to lending the funding you need, what the conditions of that funding are, and being able to do it in a reasonable time to enable you to progress. I think one of the things that's important in that process is having something initially that says we are interested, and that's the sort of illustration of terms piece. And there are still agencies around the country that don't listen when housing co-ops want to put a bid in on a property until they've got some evidence that there's a mortgage lender taking them seriously. And I think that's appalling, actually, but it tends to be, you know, something that crops up in conversation quite often, that groups need something from us to say, yeah, we are interested. We can't give you an offer at this stage because we've got more work to do, but we can at least give you a letter that provides evidence that that we're serious about providing the support that you need to make the purchase. I mean, the other couple of things I was going to mention, picking up on what was said in particularly in Andy's piece, but also in Seasalt's as well, is that, you know, whilst there was a lot of really good information in both presentations, from our point of view, and I think I speak for Cheryl as well, there's nothing that's been said tonight that we didn't know, and that's not a criticism. That's just basically saying we do understand what's possible and what the various models are. We've come across this on a week in, week out basis, and I don't want to sound glib about that because we're learning all the time, but it is an area that that we're very familiar with. And generally, I would say that if you've got something that stacks up and is going to work, as long as you're not completely ignoring ecological issues in your proposals and, you know, refusing to do anything to the property even though it clearly needs it, then we're likely to be interested in supporting you. Have I missed anything, Cheryl, that you would like to add?
No, I think we've covered it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's, there are certain, housing co-op projects, particularly the buy-to-let model that Andy explained, have a certain similarity to them. It's when you get into more complicated structures like the CLT partnership or the mutual home ownership society model that it becomes, increasingly more challenging. But that's not to put anybody off. It's perfectly possible to do these things, and we are doing these things. And hopefully, as more of these projects that come through under these different structures happen, they'll become more the norm as well. And hopefully we'll be talking about several MHOSs and student housing co-ops in Wales in another 5 or 10 years' time. It's certainly changing rapidly, and I do think that the pandemic, in some ways, has been quite a catalyst for people thinking differently about the way they want to live, and setting up intentional communities is definitely something that's becoming, I don't want to say flavour of the month, but it's certainly becoming more prevalent in the enquiries that we're getting at Ecology, which I think is quite an interesting and unexpected outcome of the way that we're changing our lifestyles and how we work and travel and all those sorts of things. And I think the co-op movement's got a big part to play in that, particularly in areas of the country where property is so expensive, and you've got the additional challenges of keeping younger generations in the areas that they've grown up, where there's areas of high tourism, lots of second homes, holiday homes and all that sort of thing, which I know is obviously a big issue in Wales. If it's maybe just worth saying, we don't lend on second homes or holiday homes, and we don't let to private landlords with a big portfolio of property. So, if everybody took that view in the finance sector, it might be a bit different, but it's sometimes important to stress what we won't do as well as what we will. But if anybody's got any questions for Cheryl or I'd be happy to answer them, or indeed, perhaps we can put up the email details in the chat and invite any particular queries that you might have. And yeah, it's worth stressing, other lenders are available. I don't want this to sound like a sort of barefaced sales pitch. It's more about, expressing a view that we're interested in trying to make projects happen that deliver genuine social and environmental value.
Thanks so much, John and Cheryl. Yeah, does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
Stunned silence.
One side, you can. Andy's had to go, and he has said that he'd be happy to answer any more questions via email, which you can send to me, and I'll make sure you connect. It was interesting, John, what you were saying, because Wales is one of those places in the UK where house prices have gone up in the last year more than anywhere else. I think, like in some place, well, overall, I think it's about 20%. And it's one of the questions that I have permanently all the time, really, is how much more inventive do we need to get to keep housing affordable from the community-led housing point of view? Because there are houses around Machynlleth and that are no longer affordable in a sort of housing co-op frame, and it needs other cash to come from somewhere to make it all work. So I'm wondering, looking ahead, and maybe we don't need to answer this now, but what are the models going to be in the future that are going to be able to deliver what Andy was talking about, these sort of older co-ops that have been around for 40 years and people aren't paying mortgages on them. And, the number of properties like that is running out. And I'm wondering where we're going from here.
I agree. I know it's something that I know, both Andy and Gautier and I have sat in seminars over the years. You're probably the same, Alan, where we know that there is this latent strength within the housing cooperative movement of, historically established co-ops that have this high equity, low rent model, and it's how we get that those strengths to support the energy that's within the end of the housing co-op sector, which has all the energy and none of the cash. And that's the conundrum, really. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are some well-established housing co-ops who are still pushing the envelope and doing new things, but there's quite a few that aren't as well, and have, you know, kind of done the hard yards back in the 80s or the late 70s and probably quite keen to just have a quiet life. But there is definitely something there that could, in the spirit of cooperation, perhaps work better than it does at the moment, but obviously bringing together the legal structures and the assessing where the responsibilities lie for that borrowing and how it works when you're talking about securing people's homes at the end of the day, that maybe funding a project at the other end of the country is an interesting one to deal with. And you know, whilst we're all cooperators in theory, when it comes down to your own front door and your own pockets, it's maybe a different challenge to support a project that's happening somewhere else in the country. I don't have the answer to that. I'm just just sort of setting out what some of the barriers can be, but it feels like there ought to be a solution somewhere, and we're certainly up for the challenge and the discussion. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, John. We look forward to picking those discussions up again in the near future. So unless anybody has one final question, then I'll bring the evening to a close and thank you all very much for coming along and being with us today. And just a final reminder that we've got another day of exciting webinars going on tomorrow, and finishing in the evening with the 6 housing projects that are happening in Wales at the moment. So yeah, it's time to switch off, and thank you again, and see you all soon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks all.
Cheers, folks. Great session.
No star.
No star.
No star.